Fans, welcome back to Working Fans Saturday, episode 35. I will be joined shortly by the man they call Dave, and not AJ Strangebrew this week. He had a medical situation come up in his family. So we're gonna, instead of discussing comedy wrestlers and their place in wrestling, we're just gonna discuss comedy wrestlers who we think fits the definition and stuff like that. Me and Dave have such a respect for the business. We don't want to be those armchair quarterbacks talking about who deserves to be in the business, who doesn't have a place if we ourselves have never trained. Producer Joe here from the Working Fans Podcast. And at the Working Fans Podcast, this is just a podcast that three lifelong fans created to have a place to talk comedy and pro wrestling. Now, our comedy podcast releases every Tuesday, while our wrestling podcast releases every Thursday. We release bonus episodes under the moniker Working Fans Presents every now and then. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Breaker, any major podcast provider. The important thing is just please like, rate, review, subscribe wherever you listen to us. Now, we have started a new thing. We are now on Amazon and Audible. So those episodes release every Monday. And that's kind of going through the archives and just releasing our old episodes in a new area. So if you want to live through the process with us again, take that journey with us again, you can find us over on Amazon and Audible. Now, if you can't get enough of us in the audio form, check out our YouTube. It's youtube.com/C/Working Fans Wrestling Pod, or just search Working Fans Podcast on YouTube. We have the whole archive is up there. And if you listen to the Working Fans Podcast, you are more than familiar with the 531. That is our signature segment where we take your top 5 lists on a particular subject, vote it down to a top 3, and then debate it down to a top 1. Now, guys, if you want to hear 3 guys talk shit about comedy, wrestling, life, anything, you will enjoy the Working Fans Podcast. And this week on the Working Fans Podcast, we have a loaded schedule for you. Tuesday on the Comedy Podcast, we have Ariel Julie, a hilarious comedian that the man they call Dave got to sit down and talk to. And on Thursday, a huge guest, Evan Ginsberg. He was an associate producer on The Wrestler. He also produced on the wrestling documentary 350 Days. It is a big week of interviews, and I don't even know what's on the Combat Cast yet. I'm going to have to ask Dave when this show starts. But before we get to that, we're going to play our intro, and then I'll bring in the man they call Dave, and we'll start talking Combat Cast and comedy wrestling this week. Well, Dave, it turns out I'm a fucking liar. Yeah, why don't you tell the people what we got going on the Combat Cast, since it was obviously filmed after that intro?
Yeah. What for the audio episode or what
tell them what the Combat Cast is going to be this coming week, because this week we got the debut of Carney USADA.
Right.
Great, yes, but next week, what will people be hearing?
We're going to be doing some review of UFC 264 and even a little preview. Maybe we just recorded, assuming that all makes it in there. But yes, so check
a little preview review thing going on, and we'll hopefully get that up so you can see that this afternoon on YouTube ahead of tonight's fights. But Dave,
and maybe you'll notice that Dave's feeling a little better when we record the review, because he's definitely hurting a little bit right now. But we ain't calling nobody out. Somebody had a family emergency, but all I'm saying is I showed up to work. I'm here.
Hashimoto got him down for the count. But we're gonna
But
talk.
best of luck. But best of luck to him. Seriously.
Yes,
Anyway, go
very
ahead.
much. We're going to talk the perfect intersection of two of our podcast interests, comedy and wrestling. AJ had originally brought it up as comedy wrestlers in their place in wrestling. But like the intro said, making that determination felt a bit much. So, almost a straight ripoff of what Cornette did. I'm going to give you the top 10 list of Cultaholic's top 10 comedy wrestlers. We'll see how you think they fit in there. And then I've got a list of a few other ones that they didn't include, but I think are quite notable. So we'll start with number 10, Orange Cassidy.
Orange Cassidy. He's very unique, and we were talking about this off air a little bit yesterday. Like, it's funny because now he's becoming like a main event player almost. He's headlining main events, and people are starting to take him seriously. But yeah, the whole thing is really just made to be for laughs and jokes. But the guy's unique. He's got great talent. He really stands out, and for whatever, he connects with the fans. And that's one thing that's interesting about comedy wrestlers is they have a connection with the fans, but because of the nature, comedy, they're not always taken seriously. But I feel like Orange Cassidy, the way he's been booked, he's starting to get there.
Yeah, and that's not with everybody because comedy wrestling sometimes feels like such a small niche of wrestling. Like you can have good wrestlers that can do funny spots, but as far as guys that are funny all the time, there's very few that I can think of that are in that upper echelon. Like, and I think Orange Cassidy is finally getting there. And it's taken however many years we've seen him come up on the indies and he's been great. Number 9 on the list, Hurricane
Helms. Another great talent, can do it all in the ring. The funny thing about this guy is that it's like he started off, he was like part of 3 Count. So that was kind of a comedy shtick there too in WCW. And he was entertaining. But man, the little conversation he had with Steve Austin when they're talking about his Green Lantern tattoo that ends up leading to this hurricane gimmick. He got so much mileage and so many years out of that, and he's still doing some of the jokes and having fun with it. The guy behind us, Mr. Shane Helms, is just so charismatic. And yeah, one of my favorite comedic characters of all time. Love the stuff he would do where he would try to choke slam the bigger super heavyweights.
Now, number 8 on the list, Heath Slater.
Interesting. Yeah, see, there you go. There's a guy, Heath, that he's got some humor to him. But
3-man band, I want kids, or I've got kids. His Impact run is, I thought you saw some interesting fire out of him early. And then they went back to a little more of the comedy.
Yeah, now he's injured. I think that I'd like to see what this guy could do, not as a comedy wrestler. I think he has potential, good heel heat here. And I think Heath's been one of those guys, he got pigeonholed in comedy. I think he's capable of doing more.
Yeah, I thought I wouldn't have seen him necessarily as just a comedic wrestler, but then you think about his highlights and they are comedy. Dave, I want to know how you feel about number 7, William Regal.
William Regal. First off, one of the greats. A guy that it's funny, like my dad really wasn't into wrestling, but like he'd sit back and watch it with me. Like William Regal was one of the guys that caught his attention. He always thought Regal's faces were just phenomenal. Like he always thought that he enjoyed Regal's comedic timing. So Regal is one of the truly good comedic wrestlers of all time, but he's also a guy that he can turn it on. He can be he can be taken seriously, and he's a guy that he's just got so much skills in terms of a technical aspect, and also like he's able to lay his shit in. This guy is just so good all around. I
think of him as just like a solid wrestler with like a good comedic side who can do the comedy well.
That's where this is interesting, right? Because it's like I would not think of Regal as a comedy wrestler, but he's great at comedy wrestling. He could definitely pull that off.
Now, number 6 on their list, one of the new sensations in this, Grado, out of Scotland.
Yes, Grado. Very funny. I love the stuff he would do, like coming out to Madonna's Like a Prayer. Pulling off the Goldberg parodies. He's something else. But there's a guy too, like he can probably go, but he's a guy kind of like Heath. I only know him in that comedy role, so I kind of wonder what he could do.
Yeah, he was one of 2 wrestlers featured on the 3rd Colt Cabana Wrestling Road Diaries documentary, Funny Equals Money. Him And number 5 on the list, Kikutaro. I don't know if you've seen much Kikutaro.
I
He
did not.
does some U.S. indies, but he's also out of Japan.
What's he
Obviously,
look like?
he's got a mask on. It's
That's
like
what I was
a
wondering.
plastic mask on, or like
Yeah.
a vinyl mask with a sideways hat.
Yes.
Without the mask, he almost looks like a young Chono, like a young Inoki without the chin. Like,
Yeah. No, I've seen him. That's what I was wondering. I didn't know his name. Okay, yeah, I've seen him around. Not very familiar with him though.
and a name you're going to be even less familiar with. Number 4, Les Kellett. From what I assume, he's out of the English scene. I don't know much about him, but number 3 on the list is the godfather of this wrestling podcast game, Colt Cabana. I'd say one of the newer guys that he can go in the ring, but he has made such a case for comedy and doing it well and in different forms in wrestling that he's probably most well known for it nowadays.
I thought you were going to say AJ Strangebrew when you said the godfather of this podcast. So, speaking of comedy wrestling, Colt is definitely he's definitely one of the first guys that pops up on my list. I'm curious to see. There's a couple other ones. I'm curious to see who's going to round up this list, though.
Well, number 2, you've already guessed it, Santino Marella.
Yes, okay. So I'm interested who's number 1 then. But Santino Marella, I would say the biggest comedy wrestler on a main stage in the last several years. You know, the stuff with the Cobra. Now, I'm saying that because this is really Colt's first main stage at AEW right now.
Yeah.
So
that's a slap in the face to number 1, the 24/7 champion, R-Truth. If he is the 24/7 champion right now.
R-Truth. Yeah, I don't know actually. There you go. Now, talk about a guy who's like took comedy and just turned it into a lasting gimmick, right? Where like here's a guy who could be serious, but Vince obviously sees him in this comedy role. He just fucking embraces it. He has fun and he gets paid, and he seems happy to do it. So good on him. I thought you were going to say Toriyano, who didn't make this list, I guess.
Oh no, this was from Cultaholic Wrestling, but that gets into comedy wrestlers not on this list. You brought up Toriyano. Who else can you think of comedy-wise that wasn't mentioned here?
Man, it's really hard to say. It's kind of funny because, like, I was thinking about back in the day, he was like known as one of probably the most dangerous, vicious heels, George the Animal Steel. But towards the end of his run, he kind of became a comedy wrestler.
Yep. And there is also that early WWF, WWF cartoonization of guys coming in where you almost get boiled down to your stereotype. And then depending on how they were selling it to kids, you'd either be a vicious stereotype or you'd be a cartoony one like the animal became.
Yeah.
Now I got Joey Ryan. He did a comedy act with that dick grab for a little bit before he started Bill Cosby and Ladies.
Yeah. Then
the Bushwhackers.
The Bushwhackers, again, some of the most vicious heels of all time.
Yeah, the Sheepherders, they would bleed, but WWF, they're licking kids and doing the funny arm thing.
Yeah. We got to lick these kids, man. That's what Vince said as soon as they came in. He's like, I'm going to have you lick some kids. So they were all for it. Got the
I thought that was the Mel Phillips line when he was interviewing, but never mind that. We got Dick Justice, a great guy on the indies. He's entertaining to watch.
Super Cop Dick Justice, right?
Super Cop Dick Justice, 100%. Yeah. Now, AEW talent Chuck Taylor. Okay. He's got to be one of the – he can do – see, he's a good wrestler, but he can do those comedy spots in the ring.
I like his pile driver. I always thought it was underrated. He doesn't get credit for that. Yeah, I know Jim Cornette likes to take him to task for not looking like a wrestler.
Yeah. But, and the invisible hand grenade, things that have gotten over as comedy spots. Like PWG has a whole nother level of comedy wrestling that Cornette is vehemently opposed to. And I'm not always on board with 100% of the time, even though I enjoy PWG. But I think it's just comedy in wrestling has evolved. It used to be a spot in wrestling, and now it's almost its own subgenre of wrestling.
Yeah. I guess, again, too, like one of the big things about if you're going to be a comedic wrestler, I think this was said recently, you can draw money, but you're just not going to be really taken serious as a main
Yeah.
event level guy for the most part. You know, there are exceptions to that rule. Kurt Angle talked about this on his podcast recently. Like, Kurt could still be taken seriously because everybody knew what a badass he really was.
Yep. Now, the last name I got on this list is Ryusuke Taguchi out of New Japan. He plays the captain.
Yes.
He's, he can go in the ring. I assume he almost trains the junior heavyweights out there, but he's always in the mix. He does funny spots in a serious match, and he was the last real comedic wrestler I could think of.
Likes to use that butt as a weapon, too.
Yep. Now, there's also a whole different type of comedy and wrestling that's branched out, and that's the stand-up shows. You got RVD. Mick Foley's the biggest one for doing it.
Yes.
I saw Dolph Ziggler do a comedy show, and I thought it was great. I've seen Mick Foley live. It's an entertaining storytelling comedy experience. What do you think of wrestlers branching out and doing that stand-up comedy?
Roddy Piper started that too before.
Yeah, Roddy Piper did it as well. He showed up a lot at the Comedy Store. He became friends with Earl Skakel, Steve Simone, and other comedians out there. So wrestlers can get into it. Do you think it's the promo ability that helps with that comedy?
Sure. You're able to like perform live. Like former guest Gene Jackson we had on this, he was doing stand-up and pro wrestling. And, you know, he said that was one of the things, like his ability to like talk on the mic in front of people helped him when he was doing stand-up. And yeah, being able to cut a good promo, I'm sure that's definitely being a great storyteller. Having the stories that guys like Piper and Foley are going to have too, especially, that's going to give you an edge.
Yeah, and if you could tell those stories and present them well, shit, you got 40 minutes of stories, 45 minutes of stories. You run a Q&A on the end of it. You got yourself a show, and it's just that we know everybody loves that type of entertainment. Now, fans, Dave's feeling under the weather. AJ Strange Brew isn't here, so we're going to cut this a little short, but next week, we're going to talk cinematic matches in wrestling. Just last weekend, I watched the Free the Narrative video that was produced by EC3 versus Matt Cardona. You have other stars in there like Pero, Bill Carr. It was interesting. And now that we're going into ROH Best of the World this weekend, having a pay-per-view in front of fans, it almost seems like cinematic matches are going to be a thing of the past. So join us next week for we'll do a live 5-3-1 on cinematic matches. Fuck it. There's enough of them.
Yeah.
Fans, we will see you next week and have a good one.
Later, guys.